Good morning.
Morning,
Thank you for being here bright and early. And Ted, thank you for being here bright and early.
Tim, thank you.
For those of you who don't know, Ted is spending more time with the media than he is with his family. So I consider it a privilege that you would join me this morning. So I'm going to plunge in and give a point of view about where we are contextually in terms of the state of higher education, which is a risky thing to do at the moment. And then I'm going to turn it to you, and you can do the same.
Deal.
The question is whether this is a Dickensian moment or an existential moment. And I'm going to argue for the Dickensian side, that it is both the worst of times and best of times. And the indicators that it's troubling aren't just because the federal government is making enormous cuts to higher education, or there are not simply because there's broadsides to elite institutions every week. Yesterday, Northwestern and Cornell were in the crosshairs. But before the election, there were real indications of deep challenges for higher ed. There's precipitous drops in public confidence, clearly the $1.7 trillion in student debt, affordability, access. There's a demographic cliff that some of you may have heard about. There's fewer 18-year-olds expected to enter, fewer 18-year-olds in general, and this could be seriously exacerbated by international students electing not to come to these shores to learn. So why do I think there's hope in the unseen? I think precisely because of the threats, because of the exogenous factors that are pressuring higher education. This is actually a moment for transformation, and we've seen this in sectors across the board. When under this kind of pressure, they have to ask themselves, what next? And pivot, whether it's incumbent institutions or new entrants. So I think there is an opportunity for us to focus on outcomes and not inputs in this sector. Ted, what do you think?
So I'm going to end up in the same place, but I'm going to start with existential. So I think that there's never really been a set of threats to American higher education all combined at the same time. And I think, Tim, you're right to point to eroding public confidence, which certainly preceded the current administrative actions, preceded the previous administration. And I think that that has been the drumbeat that we haven't paid attention to in the country. What is it that we're not doing as a sector that is helping people lose or making people lose confidence in us? And I think that's an existential question. What are we delivering? Is it the right thing? Is it being delivered to the right people? And is it being delivered to the right people in the right way? I think that the answer to all of those is not quite. And so that's the existential threat. But I think the moment is actually a productive moment for us because we can and should and will use some of the chaos that we're in to build new kinds of institutions, new infrastructures, new ways of thinking about it. And that's one of the great things you and I have been working on.
So to the things that we've been working on, I'm not going to do a history lesson, but 52 years ago, the Carnegie Foundation created something called the Carnegie Classifications, which sounds for institutions of higher education, which for many of you may sound sort of oblique. What it was an effort at the time to say, what is this landscape of higher education? And you've probably heard of R1 or Research 1 institutions. That's a Carnegie classification. So since 52 years ago, they've actually become much more important than people recognize and influence the sector in pretty remarkable ways. They anchor some of the college rankings that we all hear about. They are influence distribution of large tranches of public capital to higher education. And they, perhaps mostly, they influence the behavior of higher education institutions themselves. So about 3 years ago, Ted and I had a conversation and said, basically, let's modernize these classifications. So first, we can actually be clear about what the landscape looks like today. Secondly, so we can be transparent about how we get to these classifications because they were completely opaque. But most importantly, let's focus on student success. Which sounds straightforward to me, but
what an odd idea.
So in 2 weeks, we're going to actually release for every higher ed institution in the country what we're calling the Student Access and Earnings Classification, which at the core, we're going to look at institution by institution, are you serving the students in the communities that you serve? So whether that's a regional community, an associate's college, a community college, whether that's a state, or whether it's the nation, with a particular emphasis on Pell Grants, which is, as you all know, a very good predictor of family income. 93% of Pell recipients' families are at $60,000 or below in terms of income. And then, likewise, look at earnings over time. So over an 8-year arc, any student who goes to a particular institution, whether they complete in that institution or not, we will account for their earnings. And then the intent there is to look in a clear-eyed way at the institutions that are in essence high access, high earnings, what we're going to call opportunity colleges and universities. These are the places that are the engines of the American dream. They are driving economic opportunity. The good news is there's hundreds of them. So discrete and particular focus on student success. So Ted, what did I miss and why does it matter?
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything other than to talk a little bit about the old way we classified institutions and just how not helpful they were, right? So they were very descriptive categories like Masters Large. And you really know a lot about an institution if it's categorized as Masters Large. I mean, just think about the decisions you can make about whether you go to that school, whether you go to work at that school, whether you support that school philanthropically. Masters Large just sings, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So in addition to, I think the big change that we're making is focusing on student outcomes, and that's the deal. And when we look at the narrative about higher education and we look at the lack of confidence, at root, I believe, and my members believe, that it's because we haven't focused sufficiently on student success. So we have a 60% completion rate, just one data point, a 60% completion rate in American higher education. What's that really mean? 100% of the people who come to our doors want a degree, sort of why they come. But we disappoint 40% of them. And over time, that has accreted into a group of people in America, Americans who are our community, who say, it didn't work for me. And so by focusing on student success, we're reversing that. We're asking the question, which are the institutions, these opportunity colleges and universities, that are truly serving students in their community, particularly students, Pell Grant students, first-generation students, students for whom higher education is the only pathway to the middle class and to the American dream. So we believe that focusing on student success is really useful. The other thing that the classifications are going to do is they're going to regroup institutions. So there are plenty of surveys that talk about ROI, and they list 3,000 colleges from 1 to 3,000, and they're not very useful for two reasons. One, they're not sensitive to the different missions of institutions. So comparing Cal State LA to Harvard is not a very useful exercise, but most of the analyses do just that. So we're grouping institutions into different kinds of institutions, not Masters Large, but a comprehensive baccalaureate institution that delivers professional degrees in a rural area, and it's public. So that kind of Myers-Briggs, for those of you who've done that kind of Myers-Briggs classification is the start. And then within that, we're going to compare institutions in terms of their access and their outcomes. So institutions are going to learn two new things in 2 weeks. One, what's their village? Who are the institutions who, by latent content analysis, look like and act like they do? And two, within that village, who's doing a really good job of promoting student success? And we think that that combination is going to give Americans, they're going to policymakers, philanthropists, parents, students, a whole new way of looking at colleges and universities, critically connected to what's happening with their students. So Tim and I talk a lot about, no, that's great. So we've got in 2 weeks on the 24th, we'll launch this thing, and we're not going to go home. So we're going to keep working on these things. So Tim, what's 10 years after launch look like?
Oh, 10 years after. I'm just trying to get through the next 2 weeks. So, but in light of the moment I think we're in, I think one of the real challenges of the defense of higher education in this context is that we anchor our defense on abstraction, on democracy, on academic freedom. Nobody outside of the academy really feels the issue of academic freedom at all. On innovation, discovery, science, these are really important things, but they're abstractions. And so I think in the immediate term, the case for higher education has to be made in terms of student success. It has to be. Because that, whether I have access to higher education, whether I earn something as a result, and I have a purposeful career as a result, and I'm not saddled with untenable debt, that resonates with everybody, in my view. So I think not just 10 years ahead, but in the immediate future, the opportunity here is to refocus on something that will be actually resonant across the board.
So as we start to focus on that, what are the things that you see ahead of us that can deepen and broaden that focus on student success? What kinds of innovation? I mean, this is the universe's great gathering of innovators. What next in terms of how do institutions move forward?
I'll give two examples. One, the sector, in my view, and this may sound hyperbolic, but I don't think it is addicted to inputs. And the reason I say that is partly because the place I'm responsible for, the Carnegie Foundation, literally in 1906 said a 4-year college degree is 120 credits. And today, it's 120 credits. We've learned a great deal since 1906 about how people learn, about what knowledge is, about from neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists, and that this idea of an input, of the conflation of time and learning, the course credit, the credit hour, is the way we should define a college learning, is outlived its useful shelf life. I say this about high schools as well, because it's just as relevant there. So the opportunity is by pivoting explicitly to outcomes and student success. That opens up the door and the question to, well, maybe there are other models that get to those outcomes that don't require this input addiction. And so some of these things are very low-hanging fruit. This is, in England, for example, you can do, generally people do a college degree in 3 years. Chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, economics, creative writing. Like, that's a shift we could make today. It would reduce the cost of college by 25%. A shout out for a 3-year degree. There are degrees in Europe where you do a 4th year, but often that 4th year is a practicum, where you're actually applying what you've learned in the classroom in a professional context, preparing you for your career. So there's low-hanging fruit here, and then because we're at ASU, there's also wildly interesting opportunities for newer models. If we stay tethered to outcomes and untether from inputs, to think about ways you could educate millions more young people at very affordable levels in ways that we're leveraging their experience, their learning in all kinds of contexts, not just in the classroom. So I think the opportunity, Ted, is for the shift to outcomes to open up the window, vector, whatever metaphor you want to use, to the development of new post-secondary modalities at broad scale that would be much more accessible, much more affordable, and much more competency-based.
I love it. I love it. And I think on the ground for institutions, that looks like a number of things. One is thinking about the end first. So if student success, which means sort of having a well-rounded education, getting a job, being a good member of a community, if that's the end in mind, and if we measure that end, we can invite all of the processes and all of the inputs to vary against that goal. So how do you get there? Well, I hope that we're moving toward a system in which some version of I don't really care is the way in which we support innovation in higher education. So Tom Vander Ark whispered in my ear about 117 years ago, badges, a lot like plastics for those of you who remember the movie, but badges. So when we were doing the survey of all of these institutions, we were looking at what the offerings were of colleges and universities, including associates colleges. The number one, the fastest growing area were certificates. So you already have this happening in higher education, where institutions are looking at breaking things into smaller pieces, establishing goals and outcomes for the competencies and skills that you need, and then being able to add those together to create something that you call a degree, that then hopefully leads to something that we call a job that leads to middle-class
and the reason tethering it to outcomes, just to stay on my message, matters so much is that like you take credentials. I was writing something the other day and I went into a rabbit hole about credentials. In 2023, some august organization recognized that there were 46,000 verifiable credentials. I went back to that august organization to see how many credentials they were verifying today. It had gone up to 93,000 in just a year and a half. That should worry us. I mean, it's important. Credentials are important. Badges are important. But without the very direct tether to what difference are they making? How do we know who's getting to do what as a result of these credentials or badges? We're at risk.
Yeah, and I think that the we don't care, my cavalier we don't care, is we don't care as long as they're good, which is important. So one of the things that we do at ACE and have done for a long time is certify non-classroom learning for college credit. So we began with the military. Lots of training in the military, lots of it is really important. If you want to be a nurse and you've been a medic for 2 tours of duty, you're probably halfway there. Well, we can certify the military learning and make that a part of someone's transcript. So I think that this is a way in which higher education can work with new providers to use the same currency, which are credits, to be able to build a stack of experiences and skills that will then allow us to broaden what we mean when we say higher education, so that it's not just a 4-year residential liberal arts degree. By the way, between 11 and 14% of enrolled college students enjoy that experience. Pause. That's the right number. That's the very small number. So in part, this existential moment is simply flipping our telescope and looking at where students are, what they do, what they need, rather than basing all of this on an old, antique model of a 4-year residential liberal arts.
Ted, you asked me this question, so I have to ask you this question, and we have like 41 seconds left. So you fast forward 10 years. Where's our sector?
I think our sector is either dead or very much alive. I vote for the second. And I think that liveliness comes from a focus on student outcomes, a willingness to let the processes of learning and education vary wildly. It means coming up with responsible ways of assessing prior learning and it has to do with institutions being much more welcoming to students who are adult students, who are veterans, who bring to us life experiences that are so important.
Drop the mic. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks all.